Zionism was becoming toxic by a deliberate strategy to equate it with all of the world's evil. It's like a nursery rhyme. It takes these very simple repetitions. Israel, Zionism, sometimes just a Star of David equals racism, apartheid, Nazism, genocide, white supremacy. And recently, we actually saw the logical conclusion of that in a placard. Keep the world clean, and you see a Star of David in a trash bin, which is the logical conclusion, because if the Star of David is the carrier of all those evils, then to keep the world clean, it has to go. And what's amazing is that there is no better example of the very ancient idea that the Jews, the collective Jew, the collective Star of David, stands between this world and utopia.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Lonely Podcast. So, I had the great honor of sitting down with Dr. Einat Wilf in Tel Aviv. Dr. Wilf is a former Israeli politician of the Labour Party. She's a public intellectual and the author of a few books, including The War of Return and We Should All Be Zionists. Dr. Wilf grew up in the Israeli peace camp, as she described it, and served as an advisor for former President Shimon and Yossi Beilin, who was another member of Knesset in Israel and considered to be the architect of the Oslo Accords. But after witnessing the bloodbath that washed over Israel in the early 2000s, Dr. Wilf started questioning her beliefs about a viable two-state solution with the Palestinians. And more deeply, what was it that the Palestinians actually wanted? In this conversation, we explore many topics, including why is it that the West is unable to admit that the majority of the Palestinians don't want and never wanted a two-state solution, how societies in decline always scapegoating the Jews and utilize anti-Zionism to divert attention from their own problems, what the October 7 did to the Israeli and Jewish psyche, Israel's existential threat, whether we should qualify this war as a war against Hamas or a war against the Palestinian narrative, and much more. Dr. Wilf is a fountain of knowledge with particular expertise on this very important topic. She also has a very important voice that I believe should be amplified. So I'm asking you to do just that. And please share this podcast episode with your friends and family with the hope that more people can reach some common sense about this issue. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Einat Wilf. Dr. Einat Wilf, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.
And I wanted to start asking you about the misconceptions of the conflict and go back to one of the first and very profound lines, I'd say, in your book, The War of Return, where you quoted the then British Foreign Secretary. I know you know it by heart. I know that, but still, and you've heard it many, many times. But I think it's so profound because the then British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, gave a speech to the British Parliament in February 18, 1947, where he said, and I quote, "His Majesty's government have thus been faced with an irreconcilable conflict of principles. For the Jews, the essential point of principle is the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. For the Arabs, the essential point of principle is to resist to the last establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of Palestine." Obviously, he was referring to the British mandate in Palestine at the time. And my question to you, as someone who, as you claim, you grew up in the peace camp in Israel, and you worked as an advisor with Shimon and Yossi Beilin, what were the basics of someone like Yossi Beilin to form this idea that we can have a two-state solution and we should proceed and pursue these Oslo Accords?
So the misconception, if you call it as such, is that we projected on the Arabs, on the Palestinians, that they wanted what we wanted, that they want a state, that they essentially want a sovereign state with everything that comes with it, an end to the Israeli military presence in the West Bank and Gaza, what is called the occupation since the War of 67. And that assumption was so fundamental that we didn't even think of it. We said a people fighting for their freedom, a people fighting for their state, a people fighting for independence. It was just written. Like, what can you expect from a people fighting for independence? It was just like, that was the assumption. We assumed that they were fighting for independence, for statehood. We projected on them that they essentially wanted what we wanted. We wanted a sovereign state, a Jewish state, to be masters of our own fate, free from empire, free from outside control, and that they wanted the same thing. And that essentially, when we ended our military presence in the West Bank and Gaza, when that would end, what they would proceed to do is establish a sovereign state that would live peace side by side with Israel. And of course, what we discovered in the most horrible way possible, about 23 years ago, with the complete collapse of what were supposed to be the final peace negotiations for Palestinian statehood in 2000 in Camp David, is that not only were they not interested in a sovereign, independent state without settlements and a capital in East Jerusalem that ends the occupation, is that again and again, they were willing to forgo all that in order to achieve the far greater goal, which Bevin astutely noticed, of no Jewish state. And we just could not fathom and imagine that this was really their goal.
Yeah, to be fair, it took me personally years and years. I only recognized that like a few years back. And I think had a pretty similar process, and maybe you can also speak to that as well. What was your personal journey? Because again, as you started in that camp, but now the way you speak, it doesn't sound exactly like that. At least you recognize some basic things that, frankly, not a lot of people on quote unquote the left recognize. So maybe what was a pivotal moment for you personally that you kind of made you reflect, oh, maybe I got it all wrong?
So the process itself was about a decade, so the first decade of the century. I grew up into the Israeli left, both socially and politically. And in the 1980s and 90s, as it moved away from the historical socialism of the founders, the Israeli left came increasingly to be defined by the idea of peace. It became to be called the peace camp. And it was governed by a very compelling and attractive idea, which was land for peace. That basically all that Israel had to do was hand over land, the land that it is acquired as a result of the 1967 Six-Day War, and that in return it will get peace. And for a while, it really seemed to be a great idea. You know, that was the basis for the so-called peace agreement with Egypt. I'm saying so-called because after 40 years, we can talk about the peace contents of that agreement. But that was the idea. Israel gave the entire Sinai Peninsula and in return got a peace agreement with Egypt. With Jordan, we signed a peace agreement when Jordan gave up its territorial claims to the West Bank. We negotiated with Syria over the same idea. And in the 1990s, when we directly negotiated, that was the big highlight and breakthrough, directly negotiated with the Palestine Liberation Organization, we assumed that the Palestine that they wanted to liberate was the West Bank and Gaza. And that, again, that all they want is that land, no more, maybe no less, but certainly no more. And that the day that they would be sovereign in that land, there would be peace. And as a result, not only did I vote for Rabin and later Barak, and I was euphoric in the 90s, and I supported Barak and Camp David and everything after, and disengagement from Gaza in 2005, I was so much in support of that because I was like, you know what? And I remembered the thinking at the time was, we're not going to let the Palestinians veto our decisions, right? They seem to be unable to say yes to any peace agreement, so we're not going to wait for them. We're just going to get out because they can't force us to just remain, inside the territories if we don't want to be there. So we'll just get out. And then I'm already working with Shimon Peres. I'm part of this process. And I remember how fundamental the idea was of getting out. The idea was we are not going to leave any excuse. We're going to get out completely. We are not going to only get out of the settlements, we're going to destroy them. The Palestinians made it clear that they don't want the houses. It really shows you the kind of thinking. They didn't think rationally saying, oh, these are good houses, we want them. They said destroy them. They wanted to get a sense of wasteland. We took out the graves. I remember the critical discussion to get out of the border with Egypt, the Philadelphia corridor. And Sharon, the prime minister, said, we're going to leave them no excuse. We're going to get out all the way to the pre-1967 armistice lines. There's going to be no military. There's going to be no civilian presence. We're not going to be on the border in Gaza. They will have zero excuses to say that, they can't build something for themselves. And, I followed the 2008 negotiations with Olmert and Abu Mazen. So all these processes, and of course the violence of the misnamed Second Intifada, which was a campaign of massacres literally weeks after the Palestinians could have had everything we were told they wanted, a Palestinian state, no settlements, no occupation. So that already led me to be in a very questioning mood as to what is exactly going on. What do the Palestinians want? Because they clearly don't want a state, and they clearly don't want an end to the occupation, and they clearly don't care about settlements or East Jerusalem, because they could have had all that multiple times, and they never take it. So as I was going through that process, I would say the really big aha moment for me was when I was invited to meet Palestinians, moderate Palestinians. I was the classic moderate Israeli, right? A supporter of two states, worked with Shimon Peres, Yossi Beilin, in the Labor Party. And I was asked to meet moderate Palestinians. There's always this view of all kinds of like these do-gooder think tanks. They're like, oh, we got to get Israelis and Palestinians to meet, right? That they got to just meet each other. So I have my story of meeting. And in those meetings, they basically made it very clear to me that the Jews are not a people. It's only a faith, a religion. And again, I'm very not religious, but very Jewish. And then they claim that the whole notion that the Jews have a connection to this land is a made-up story designed to steal theirs. And I'm thinking, wow, okay, one does not need to believe in God. One does not need to be Jewish to recognize that the most continuous, deep relationships between a people and a land is between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. And then they would say, so you have no right to self-determination. It's only the right of peoples and nations. You're not a people, you're not a nation, and certainly not here in a land to which you have no connection. And I went back from these workshops and I was like, those are the moderates. And if those are the moderates, then the way they speak about the conflict and what I thought about it just don't meet. I thought it was about land. And they're telling me that it's about my very existence here.
Yeah, this is so profound. I had not like that, but I had a kind of a similar situation where I started my academic studies in France. And I remember being like a very open-minded. I grew up in the West Bank, actually, but in a different side of it. Like in the Jordan Valley, a lot of people there are pretty liberal. It's kind of a different, different thing. And I was, yeah, sure, I'm happy to talk to you about Israel. Sure, criticize Israel, no problem. And I'm talking to so many people on college. And it took me so long to understand that they're not talking about 67 borders. They're not talking about a two-state solutions. No, the mere existence of the state of Israel is a giant problem that should never have happened. And I think a lot of people, and I do want to ask you about it later, in Israel don't understand that, which is very frustrating. I don't know if you share this frustration, but I know it's super frustrating to me. But I guess the kind of next thing I wanted to ask you about is kind of go back on to what you just said. The world still insists today, literally every Western leader, from Macron to Rishi Sunak to Biden, on the two-state solution. There are some talks about recognition of a state of Palestine. as some sort of which I think a lot of Israelis interpreted some sort of reward for the October 7th. And they keep on saying that even though we know from polling data that 70 to 80% of Palestinians support the October 7th, both in Gaza and the West Bank. We know that a majority of Palestinians support Hamas. We know that there is literally no opposition to them. Like, I keep wondering how come that the Palestinians did not choose to make a big effort and fight their own, like Hamas, if they are so terrible. At least this is what all the Westerns claim, that they don't represent the Palestinian people. And also, and basically when you listen to the Palestinian Authority's leaders speak, it's like they're citing chapters from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, like literally. And these are, like you said, are the moderate Palestinians we should discuss with. So why are so many world leaders keep on with this idea and just are they misinformed? Are they don't want to, they can't handle the truth, like the Jack Nicholson famous one? What is it? What is it that is so problematic to just admit, hey, we have a major problem here, we need to address it?
So I struggle with that too. And I oscillate between the more innocent explanations and the more sinister one. So the more innocent explanations is that the West has created an imagined Palestinian. And in that imagination, which in many ways is the imagination that I described of the Israeli left, we project on them the idea that they are a people seeking liberation, seeking an end to the military occupation, seeking independence, a people motivated by extreme hardship. And none of that is true. And sometimes my innocent explanation is that there is a kind of neo-colonial, call it even Orientalist attitude in it, that refuses to actually listen to what the Palestinians themselves are perfectly capable of saying. And I invented a word for that, Westplaining, yes. Because Palestinians will clearly say, we support Hamas. What Hamas did was absolutely illegitimate. And the Westerner will say, Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. And the Palestinians were like, they very much are. They represent us. We love what they did. And the West was like, no. You don't understand. They don't represent you. And the Palestinians...
The soft bigotry of low expectations.
Exactly. It's a whole projection. And then they'll be like, we don't want two states. We want one. And people are like, no. You want two states and we'll recognize a state. And I'm like, you actually can't force them to want something that they've never wanted for themselves. Go back to Beilin. They never wanted an Arab state in the land if that state will live next to a Jewish state. Their priority has always been, for a century, first no Jewish state, then everything else. So they've been very consistent. So my more innocent explanation is this kind of neo-colonialism, bigotry of low expectation, projection, Orientalism, all in that area. If I go to the more sinister explanations, then I have to go to the place where somewhere in the deep recesses of the West, the idea of a sovereign Jewish state still somehow feels wrong. And that deep kind of subconscious of the West is the one that supports and funds the Palestinian cause, which was never anything but the no Jewish state cause. But it tries to pretend that it's a constructive cause that wants constructive things like liberation and a sovereign state, rather than the cause that it always declaredly, openly was, a no Jewish state cause.
Yeah, so how do we shift this narrative? Like, I know you're trying hard to do that, and I admire you for that. But I'm really curious, first of all, what kind of narrative are we shifting it for? And how do we try at least to do that?
So I only have one response, which is give Palestinians the respect of taking them at their word. It's the only message that I keep repeating. One of the things that I'm most proud of in the book, The War of Return, is that Adi Schwartz, my co-writer, and myself have given in that book the Arabs, the Palestinians, the respect of not only taking them at their word, but the respect of treating them as agents in history, people who are perfectly capable of knowing what they want, declaring what they want, and repeatedly and consistently taking actions that are commensurate with what they say they want. I mean, one of the things that you see on the Arab and Palestinian side is that their actions have always been consistent with their goals. Their declarations have been consistent. They have never wavered, again, to their credit, which really shows you how powerful this Westplaining neocolonial process is, that they are constantly spoken over, explained over, even though they make it clear what they want. Now, the only reason to try to shift the narrative is if you think that the problem is that, again, it's this neocolonialism, Orientalism, Westplaining, then there's value in that. If the underlying reason is that deep in the recesses of the Western subconscious is that they can't handle a Jewish state, they can't handle the idea of sovereign Jews, of Jews defending themselves by themselves, it goes too deep against theological conceptions of Jewish powerlessness. If you believe in that, then the only reason to try to kind of shift the narrative is to expose that, to force people in the West to come to terms with their deep subconscious. And maybe hope that a bit like Sartre after World War II, who said that he had to work every day to dislodge anti-Semitism from his brain because it was so much in how he grew up. Maybe there will be some people who rise up and say, we have to acknowledge how deep-seated in the Western consciousness is the inability to come to terms with sovereign Jews.
Yeah, that's a great. It's a kind of a great segue to what I wanted to just talk to you about next, which is what is going on specifically on college campuses in the United States and actually all over the Western world, as we call it. I went to UCLA, it was like 6 years ago, something like that. And in my first week of orientation, I was told if I am going to say to a woman that she's, wow, you're very strong, then I'm microaggressing her because I'm saying you're very strong, but what I want to say, you're very strong for a girl. So that is a form of an aggression they call microaggression, and that can amount to, I'm not joking, this is literally what the expert told me, to PTSD, to post-trauma like syndrome in people. The same places had terrible and vile demonstrations. Many of them actually turned violent against Jewish students, chanting famous genocidal slogans. And we all saw the congressional hearings where the presidents of Harvard, MIT, UPenn were unable to clearly condemn these things as violating their code of conduct. So, and I wanted to ask you, how did that happen? Like, how come, I try to, I hope that we can, I hope that your first explanation is the right one and not the more sinister one, because the sinister one is I don't even know how you address that. Let's say the soft bigotry of low expectations, maybe that's like kind of the explanation that I hope is the right one. But how did that happen? That a plural, I don't know, I believe it's a majority of 18 to 24 years old Americans, they think Hamas is legitimate and they support them as the governing power in Gaza. How did that happen? How did it happen that we have just have no presence in those areas, in those institutions. There's nothing there. There's only their narrative. Do you know? Because you've been in those institutions for a long time, so I'm just curious about your perspective.
So I have a few semi-explanations. I doubt that they will all be definitive or kind of comprehensive. One is that it is the enduring Soviet legacy in the West. One of the people who really, I think, did great research is Isabella Tabarovsky, who, precisely because she's a Jew who came from the former Soviet Union, they were the first to notice it. They knew that the Soviet anti-Zionism of the 60s and 70s and 80s, which used, again, the Palestinian cause of no Jewish state to globalize itself. And they introduced what I've come to call over the years the placard strategy, the equation of Zionism with every evil in the world equals colonialism and imperialism and apartheid and racism and genocide and Nazism. And what the Soviet Union also did was to launder those ideas through international bodies, essentially precipitating their corruption. So the idea of Zionism equals racism was brought to the United Nations and thereby given respectability, and then that Israel is apartheid. And now when we're saying South Africa, which is still very much governed by these Soviet ideas, bring genocide to the International Court of Justice, it's part of the playbook of the Soviets to launder the most sinister ideas through international bodies. And really, the Soviets do not get sufficient credit for their contribution to global Jew hatred. They literally wrote the book, right? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And today, everyone can publish a book. It's no big deal. But imagine 120 years ago, a book meant respectability. So if all these terrible ideas about Jews were in a book, well, that's real. And if you look at it, the Nazis didn't invent much. It's pretty much the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which remains a hugely popular book in the Arab world, where they don't think it's a forgery. They think it's fact. And after World War II, the Soviets create anti-Zionism and Palestinianism as the new respectable masks for the old Tsarist Russian idea. And we need to maybe say a word on why so much gets invested in being anti-Zionist. And because one thing that you need to understand, and it's really relevant to what's happening in American universities, is that the rise of anti-Zionism, and certainly before that anti-Semitism, is always the mark of a failed society. You do not find in history a society that became obsessed. I'm not talking about the polite anti-Semitism of high society. I'm talking about a society that becomes obsessed with the idea that the collective Jew, that the Jews, that the Zionists are at the source of their problems. The most important thinker on societies in crisis, his name is René Girard, and he said that societies in crisis ask two questions: what to do and who to blame. Societies that ask what to do ultimately emerge from the crisis. They take action, they get out. Societies that become obsessed with who to blame basically wallow in the crisis and sink into it. So I don't define anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism as being about hatred or bigotry or conspiracy or prejudice. I define it as a political scapegoating mechanism of societies in crisis that tends to be most effective in those societies that already have a history of cultural capital invested in Jews. So that would be essentially the Muslim world and anywhere where you had Christianity. So from Russia and the Soviet Union all the way to America. So any place that had a kind of substructure of cultural capital of centuries and millennia invested in Jews will have that scapegoat. Because at one point, someone asked me, but why the Jews? Okay, I understand the scapegoating mechanism. I understand the need of societies in crisis to blame someone. It's easy. It's often easier than actually taking difficult action to resolve the crisis. But why the Jews? You can scapegoat a whole bunch of people. And my answer is that with so much cultural capital invested in the Jewish scapegoat by now, it's just too tempting. It's an off-the-shelf, ready scapegoat. So for leaders, for intellectuals who need to scapegoat, it's just too tempting not to use it. So the question is always, why is the scapegoating mechanism implemented now? And once you begin to ask the question this way, rather than what they want you to think of, like, what have the Jews done now? If you turn the table and ask, why is society suddenly needs this reliable scapegoat? You begin to finally ask the correct question and focus on the failure of that society. So the failure of academia, the failure of the global left to actually achieve any of its declared goals. There was an American member of Congress, I think Cori Bush, who a couple years ago said something like that Americans don't have universal health care because of Israel. Now, let me say that I think that it is
so brilliant, Cori Bush.
Yeah.
My God, this woman.
Yeah, so I think it's abhorrent that Americans don't have universal health care. I can understand how they have not figured out what every advanced nation has already figured out, that it costs less and creates more health. But there are numerous reasons why Americans don't have health care, and none of them have to do with Israel.
That's right.
So rather than acknowledge her failure as someone who should be promoting universal health care, much easier to use the traditional scapegoat. I call it that we can't have nice things because of Israel.
That's great.
But that's like just anywhere you see the rise of that, scratch the surface and you will see failure.
That's so accurate. Cori Bush is someone who advocates for defunding the police while spending tens of thousands of dollars for her own personal security. And when confronted, she doesn't seem to understand that it's like a paradox. It's weird. Anyway, she's not, I don't know, the sharpest tool in the shed, I would say. But
it's the bigger issue, and she speaks to something that people. Again, when a society is in a crisis, when it doesn't know who it is, what it wants anymore, there's a sense of dislocation. And there's no question that we're going through a massive dislocation that maybe in 100 years we'll look back and we'll say, okay, the technology, our whole sense of identity, of society, of cohesion was dislocated. When a society goes through intense dislocation, then certainly again, in the West, in Russia, in the Arab world, there's no greater certainty in those societies than that the Jews did it.
Right.
And you just grab into something certain. It gives you just something to hold on to in a dislocated world.
Yeah, it's amazing. Ayaan Hirsi Ali,
yes,
she's, again, such an important voice, someone who grew up in Somalia and escaped, went through hell, and became a public intellectual, like I believe a member of the Dutch parliament as well.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, when I was a girl in Somalia, I didn't know anyone who knew a Jew, but I knew that I hate them more than anything else. That's it's so profound in the Arab world, and it's incredible.
I want to say maybe something about this hatred, because someone at one point, I explained this whole intellectual framework, and he said, but I see those demonstrations. I see, and there's hatred there.
Yeah.
There's emotion. He's like, it doesn't seem like some intellectual scapegoating of who's to blame. And that also goes to what Ayaan said about Somalia. And I said, look, if you are being told that your father can't get cancer treatment because of Israel, that you're sitting in Somalia and you're basically hearing that this is a failed society because the Jews are behind it. If you're hearing that Germany lost World War I and you're suffering massive inflation because the Jews stabbed you in the back, then the emotion is going to be very real. You're going to hate them because they stand between you and a better life. And that creates hate. So when people talk about the hate as an abstract thing, oh, we don't hate Jews. I'm like, no, it's the hatred that comes from the scapegoating, from the constant story of like, you can't have what you want in life because of them. And then you're going to hate them.
Yeah, and you can counter that with societies, especially Arab societies that had, moved away from that. And those societies that have moved away from that have relationship with Israel today, or will have in the near future, I hope, which kind of it's a perfect example of what happens, like you said, society is in decline when nothing works. Okay, this the perfect solution, just blame the Jews. And societies that do work and are, up and running, like the UAE, that's a perfect example. They say, okay, yeah, why not Israel? And so I guess another question I have there is, what can we do differently? Israelis, Jews, we always like to kind of, oh, we did this and we did that. It's like we explain to ourselves why the Palestinians, someone is acting the way they act because we did something wrong. But I do want to ask that here, because it's not just that when you go to any, Middle Eastern department in most universities in the West today, you wouldn't find anyone who is a Zionist. How did that happen? And like, we actually discussed how did that happen, but what can we do to change it? Does Israel as a country should look at it as a national interest to invest in that? And if so, like, how should we go about it?
So this is the reason I called my most recent book of essays, We Should All Be Zionists.
Right.
I remember when I began to be alerted to it, that something's going on. I remember when I first gave a talk to the socialist members of the European Parliament. I was a member of the Labour Party. I thought they were my colleagues, right? I'm a socialist, they're a socialist. And I'm talking in this panel, and I'm very naturally saying things like Labor Zionism, my background is Labor Zionism, the Labor, Israel Labor Zionism. I mean, I'm just saying it like casually. But I'm beginning to notice that whenever I say the word Zionism, my audience cringes. And I'm beginning to get the sense, and this is 20 years ago, that merely by using the word Zionism, I have taken myself out of any notion that I am their colleague and that I might as well just place myself on the extreme right of the seating of the European Parliament. And I remember when an American pollster, with the best of intentions, said that Jews should stop using the term Zionism because it's toxic. Now, he was saying it as a pollster. He's like, he checked, the number said that Zionism looked bad, so don't use the term. And that's when I started, because I wrote my first essay saying, absolutely not. Because the term Zionism did not become toxic by some kind of innocent process. That it was a deliberate, ongoing process. I did not at the time yet know how much it was a Soviet process, but I recognized how it was working, this placard strategy, that I said that Zionism was becoming toxic by a deliberate strategy to equate it with all of the world's evils. And if you think about the strategy, it's geniusly simple. It's like a nursery rhyme. It takes these very simple repetitions. Israel, Zionism, sometimes just a Star of David equals racism, apartheid, Nazism, genocide, white supremacy. So and it just becomes this nursery rhyme in people's heads. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equal evil. And recently, we actually saw the logical conclusion of that in a placard. I don't know if you saw those placards that say, keep the world clean, and you see a Star of David in a trash bin. Which is the logical conclusion, because if the Star of David is the carrier of all those evils, then to keep the world clean, it has to go. And what's amazing is that there is no better example or really kind of demonstration of the very ancient idea that goes back all the way to Paul, that the Jews, the collective Jew, the collective Star of David, stands between this world and utopia.
Mm.
And so I began to write about the fact that all these ideas are not innocent. They're not by mistake, that Zionism has not become toxic just because, Israel did this or that. It actually is moving forward independent of any Israeli actions. You have this government, you have that government. We are in Gaza, we're out of Gaza, we build settlements, we freeze, we remove. And this was relentless. So once you begin to see that it's not connected to Israeli actions, then you're saying, okay, Israeli actions are one thing. I can be critical of those actions, but the notion that they are tied to the process of turning Israel and Zionism and the Star of David into the world's carrier of evils is actually not what's going on here. So I became an advocate for actually being very clear that we are Zionists, because the other side is trying to push us back, not for any good cause. And over the years, I've described this kind of dynamic in what I came to call the pound of flesh. Because contrary to what Shakespeare wrote, it's the opposite. It's not the Jews who demand a Gentile pound of flesh. It's the opposite. Sometimes metaphorically, too often physically. And the way I describe the metaphorical pound of flesh is that the Jews were demanded to mutilate a certain element of their identity in order to become acceptable. And the thing about the pound of flesh dynamic is that it's relentless. It works like bullying. So let's say you hand over a pound of flesh, and your pound of flesh is to say that Netanyahu is terrible. Fine, that's easy. Netanyahu is terrible. Give it over. Now, bullies, when you hand them your lunch money, they don't say thank you and never come back, right? They come back the next day and they want more. So this dynamic of bullying is relentless. Once you agree that Netanyahu is terrible, then they come back the next day and then the next day. And then you have to move to say that Israel was born in sin and that you hate Israel. And it becomes what I began to call exorcism ceremonies. We actually see them on TikTok. They are like the full exorcism display of Jews saying, out, Israel, out. I have nothing to do with you. And in a way saying, I'm the good kind of Jew. Spare me. Yeah. I'm not like those others. And the thing about the dynamic of the pound of flesh, because it's relentless, is that it never stops until there are no more pounds of flesh to hand over, until Jews are no longer recognizable as Jews or they no longer exist. So what I've discovered over the years is that a lot of people who were subjected to that dynamic, and I was subjected to that dynamic too. I was like, hey, I'm a good kind of Israeli. I support two states, and I'm against the settlements, and the settlers are terrible, and I want to divide Jerusalem. I think that's just a good idea regardless. And, I want to do all these things. I'm the good kind of Israeli. Please like me. Only to discover that, no, they want everything. They will never relent. So that's the moment, I call it the T intersection, where you can either hand over another pound of flesh, or you're basically saying, I'm done. I'm not playing this game anymore. And what I've seen over the years is that a lot of Jews each had personally that moment of T intersection where they kind of viscerally understand that this is not going to be over ever, right? So then they take a step back. And this is the moment when a lot of them essentially reclaim Zionism, not as a movement for self-determination, but just as a shorthand for saying, I'm a confident Jew, you can't bully me, go look for victims elsewhere. And over the years, I described how this dynamic works in terms of Jewish organizations on campus. It started when I was in the 90s in America. I was active in the kind of the AIPAC chapter supporting two states, and that was the 90s. And then there was J Street, and then J Street U, and then If Not Now, and then Jewish Voices for Peace. And then if you're not the militant Jewish co-chair of Students for Justice in Palestine, you're just not a good enough Jew. And this is how the dynamic works. And sometimes people ask me, how can we let Jews understand what's going on? And I always said, look, I'm putting all my material out there. I'm giving the talks and the YouTube videos and the Twitter and the essays and the books. I'm all putting it out there. But what's really going to, clinch it for a lot of Jews is that the other side just can't help themselves. The bullies can't help that relentless dynamic. They can't help always asking more and more. Just a couple of days ago, I retweeted something that was just perfect. Someone said how left-wing Jews have failed this moment because they fail to celebrate October 7th as a moment of resistance, and they insist on mourning fellow Jews in Israel. And I retweeted that because I said, this is perfect. This is the complete display of the pound of flesh dynamic at work, showing that no matter how much Jews will contort themselves to say we're the good Jew, saying Kaddish for Hamas and all that, only to discover that it's never enough.
Yeah, and there's so many examples of that. I think one of the most disappointing one for the Jewish community in the diaspora, especially in the United States, is the relationships between the Jewish community and, specifically the BLM movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, where a lot of left Jews, which is the majority of the Jewish community in the United States, they vote Democrat. They were so, they were the first one there. They were leading the marches, and then they just got completely backstabbed by this movement that never lied, by the way. They said right there on their charter, exactly what they want. They don't want Israel. They oppose Zionism, oppose all of that. But what you said is correct. It takes, it just takes, I see it all the time. It takes the Jewish person himself to, experience this moment, to really understand exactly what's going on. But is there a way that we can somehow in Israel or as the Jewish community writ large do something in terms of, should you try and train Ph.D. students, professor? I don't know. I'm trying to figure out what is there to do, except from what you said, embrace Zionism and not be ashamed. Don't give away your pound of flesh. But other than that, just to counter those voices that are so predominating in those universities.
So it actually works together, because once we gain our self-respect, and I have to say, at the end of the day, bullies never respect their bullieds. I don't know what you would call the bully.
Their victims.
Yeah. They never respect them. They only respect those who stand up for themselves. I remember you talked about academia, and when it became clear that the Middle East departments were essentially being hijacked to the no Jewish state cause under the guise of Palestinianism, then there was a move in the 90s to establish the Israel Studies departments. And now the Israel Studies departments have become, in large part, the anti-Israel Studies departments, often with the cooperation of Jews, who realized that their only way increasingly to advance in academia, as a student in Israel once told me, look, I have two options. I can do a post-Zionist Ph.D. in Israel or an anti-Zionist Ph.D. in the United States. Those are pretty much the options. So I was sitting a few weeks before October 7th in an academic discussion, an academic conference in New York. And it was mostly Israel studies, mostly Jews, and all of them were different versions of the placard strategy, talking about Israel apartheid and Israel and, Zionism versus racism and all that. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the three non-academics were the only ones that had a somewhat different view. I was one of them. I mean, I was a visiting professor at once, but I'm not an academic or someone who came from the American administration. And he was a negotiator in the past, and he had to say, it's not all on Israel that there's no peace. And even that was kind of like, how dare he? And I remember listening to all the speakers in that conference, decrying Israeli apartheid, racism, and all that. And I'm thinking, in what world do you think this turns out well? Yeah. In what world do you think that you constantly handing over those pounds of flesh will turn out well for the Jewish people, for academia, for America, for that matter? There's just no arc in which historically this turned out well, really. So for me, yes, a lot of it is about understanding where this heads, where this goes. So it's not just about an attitude of self-respect, of understanding who we are, of standing up for who we are. And in that sense, of course, the Arabs and the anti-Zionists are our best allies because, as I said, they don't lie, they can't help themselves. So we just need to constantly challenge them on their opinions. But it's not just about, again, the standing up and the self-respect. We need to understand where this goes because, I participated in a couple of high-profile debates in the last few years as whether anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. And I lost those debates, and I discovered that because you're making the broad claim, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, all you need to do is to bring one anti-Zionist Jew, bring the Satmar Jew, bring the JVP Jew. This is why they get platformed. They're so useful. And to say, no, I'm against Zionism. And the whole argument, which is a blanket argument, falls down. But when I participated in these debates, it was very clear to me, especially from the audience response, that these were not intellectual debates. Oh, we're debating this or that, or, clapping for those who won. I realized this is a very existential question of practice. Not what happens in theory, but what happens in practice. What happens in practice when anti-Zionism comes to dominate a society. And here, the historical arc is definite. Every society, whether it's the Arab world in the 50s and 60s, 40s and 50s, or the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s and 80s, or Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, or today's American campuses, or Venezuela, or Poland in the 60s, every society that became obsessed with anti-Zionism became hostile to Jewish life, even though they always protested that it's not about Jews, we love Jews, have nothing against Jews. It always turned hostile to Jewish life, and if this was not arrested, then there were no Jews left. So this is my argument. I worked with a young student. She said, how should I talk to university administrators? And I told her, leave all the arguments as to whether anti-Zionism is just tell them that the arc is always the same. At the end of this arc, you are going to have no Jews on your campus. If that's what you want, fine. But just know that this is where it heads. And it has nothing to do with your personal prejudices or whether you think that Israel did something bad. Fundamentally, a society that becomes obsessed with anti-Zionism ultimately has no Jews left. If that's what you want, by all means. But just know that this is where you're heading.
Yeah. Did you find any specific strategies in discussing with, folks? Obviously, there are those who have such conviction against Israel and you can see the fire in their eyes and the hate. And there are the fools that just don't know any better. They would go and chant, but they would not know which river and which sea. They would just do it because everyone is doing that. They want to be a part of the group. Did you find any, good strategies in how to address that, how to kind of crack their beliefs, add some cracks into their beliefs or something like that?
Yes, the best strategy that I found remains to let both sides speak for themselves. I've taught a course as a visiting professor in Georgetown called Zionism and Anti-Zionism. It should be out soon, thanks to my student Zoe. It will become a series of 5 YouTube videos. And the way that I taught that course is by teaching the direct texts, teaching the Zionist texts and teaching the anti-Zionist texts. We did not read about Zionism, and we did not read about anti-Zionism. We actually read what the people themselves said. And the beauty of that is that once you read what they themselves said, Zionism emerges as what it was: a bunch of Jews struggling to figure out how to live in this modern world of vast changes, with a big idea and a big dream, and with the best of intentions, writing about how this will promote the development of the region and they will coexist with their... I mean, you really have to work very hard and to kind of take things out. My favorite, for example, is people bring this quote from Herzl. We need to bring the entire edifice down and replace it with something else. And people use that quote to say that Herzl wanted to displace the Arabs and, insert a Jewish state. And like you read all of Herzl. And I was like, that's an odd quote. And then I find that it's in the introduction to the Jewish state where he says that we need to bring down the Jewish intellectual edifice of the exile and replace it with the mindset of sovereignty. So you really have to work very hard to make Zionists appear sinister in their writings. And you don't have to work at all to show anti-Zionism for the sinister movement that it is. I'm not talking about Jews, and I separate between Jews engaging in the early 20th century and Bundism and communism and opposing Zionism, again, as part of the intra-Jewish debate as how to best approach modernity. But when you look at Arab anti-Zionism, at Soviet anti-Zionism, at Christian, essentially Western secularized anti-Zionism, there is nothing innocent that you can find in those texts. The sinister, annihilationist, supremacist element, the one that can't come to terms with the idea of Jewish sovereignty, Jewish power, Jewish self-determination, Jewish equality, it comes across so clearly. So that I found to be the most effective element. Just let them talk.
That's great. That's a great advice. I want to switch gears and talk about Israel post-October 7th. I read your book before October 7th, and when you read your book and when you know, like, Israeli history, you theoretically should not be very surprised that when giving the opportunity, the Palestinians would do exactly what they did on October 7th. In the first few chapters of your book, you give like gruesome descriptions of what the Arabs did right here in 47 and before Israel was established. And I don't think that a lot of Israelis growing up in Israel actually have that in the back of their heads. Now they would definitely have it because it's so, recent. But these stories, they're horrible. And I understand 2 things. First, that the Arabs have not changed any tactics in the last more than 100 years. And the second, that once again, we should not be very surprised by the brutality. I do want to ask you if you were surprised by that, by the October 7th attack, and in what way exactly?
I was surprised by the Israeli failure to defend our border, to defend the kibbutzim, to defend the towns, to defend our citizens. I don't know that we will ever really get over that fundamental failure. That's still the massive question mark that we need to answer to. But I was not surprised by the fact that this was the Arab goal and that this is what they wanted to do And I was certainly not surprised by the Arab-Palestinian exhilaration at the realization of that. Over the years, and we also talk about it in the book, people have created this innocent idea of what return means in the Palestinian imagination, that it's this nostalgia for a long-gone home of a great-grandparent. In the book, we include texts from the 50s, from the 60s, from the 70s, in which it's very clear that the Arab-Palestinian vision of return is a violent, brutal triumphalism over the Jewish state. They're very clear about it. And so what I've been saying since October 7th is I tell people October 7th is return. In case you have any innocent ideas about it, that is the step-by-step, minute-by-minute realization of what Palestinians imagine as return. This is why Sinwar is euphoric. He believes he is the new Salah ad-Din, right? In the Arab-Palestinian imagination, Israel is the second Crusader state, a foreign implant that will be essentially annihilated and removed by a new Salah ad-Din. Sinwar believes he is that. And this is why you saw so much elation on October 7th, because that is what they were waiting for, dreaming of, preparing for 75 years. Hamas merely executed it in the most successful way in the past 75 years. But Hamas has very much did that on behalf of the Palestinian vision, not in hijacking, not in contradiction to it, in realization of it. So, no, my surprise was at our failure to defend against, again, what the Arabs, Palestinians have repeatedly made clear is their intention.
Yeah. And one of the things that surprised me is people's surprise to that. Meaning, I saw, an old friend from the military who was called on to the reserve and spent a few months, I believe, in Gaza. And he gave an interview to one of the Israeli TV channels where he said, I was shocked. Every house, every place had the map of Israel. And it was all just, it had a flag of the Palestinian flag. And I think, and to me, that was surprising that he was surprised. And my question to you, do Israelis understand what they're dealing with? Do they actually understand the risk? And do they treat it as an existential risk?
So I read something by someone who said, my grandmother, who came from a former Arab country, said, my grandmother always told me, as soon as the Arabs will have the chance, they will slaughter us. And I thought my grandmother is so primitive. And she was right. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people say, how could Jews who have come from Arab and Muslim lands failed to be the bridge to peace? And they all come up with the Ashkenazi Zionists oppressed the Mizrahi Zionists, turning them against their true, authentic Arab identity. And have you considered that they actually knew better than all of us what the Arabs and Muslims will do given the chance, because the reason they're no longer living in the Arab and Muslim world is that they did to them. They butchered them as soon as they had the chance. And this is why 1 million Jews within a few years were completely ethnically cleansed. And that's an actual ethnically cleansing, not the imagined ones that people talk about, of communities that predated the Arab and Muslim world within a decade. So perhaps those Jews actually knew better. Will someone actually give them the respect of not thinking that they turned against their authentic Arab identity by evil Ashkenazi Jews? No, they actually had a better understanding. The person who wrote about it beautifully, by the way, is Mati Friedman.
As always.
From in his book, Spies of No Country. in which he talks about the Jews from Arab lands who were spying. And he said they knew it. They intimately knew the Arab brutality towards Jews who dared stand up for themselves, the complete unacceptability of the idea of Jews as equals, as sovereign, as people defending themselves. Sometimes when I explain why really the Arab opposition to a Jewish state, there's no objective reason for it. It was a small state. It was mostly on malaria-infested land. Arab countries were popping up left and right, getting massive land. There was no displacement. Why? Why the opposition to a Jewish state? And like I said, a big part of it is the unacceptability of Jewish equality for a people who for 1,400 years have only ever known the Jews as dispossessed, displaced, powerless, at the mercy of Arab and Muslim rulers who defend them or don't defend them according to their needs. And sometimes I give examples. I say, there were a lot of markers for the lower status of Jews in Arab and Muslim lands. One of them was, for example, that they could not ride horses. Horses were a mark of dignity. Jews could only ride donkeys. Or Jews, of course, could not bear arms because they were only protected at the mercy of an Arab and Muslim leaders. Now, I always say, imagine that in the midst of the Arab-Muslim world, which again, kudos to them, since the 7th century, the conquests have been hugely successful. It has become the Arab and Muslim world. Imagine that in the midst of that, those lowly Jews are riding horses, right? You look at the early Zionist images, they're riding horses, they're bearing arms, they're insisting on defending themselves by themselves. Imagine the civilizational shock of Jews daring to claim equality, dignity, the right to self-defense. That's the kind of civilizational shock that is always met by violence and the desire to put Jews back where they belong.
Yeah, I just recently also read in one of Mati Friedman's book, which has special connections to my family, which is the Aleppo Codex.
Yes.
My great-grandfather was the guardian of that synagogue in Aleppo. Wow. Where he took the book out during the riots. So I love Mati's writing, and he's
beautiful writer.
He's great, and I think he has a very good voice kind of to describe the situation. And I talked to my grandmother, who's still alive, about that, and she remembers it so vividly, the riots and what happened. And I have to say, similar to what you described, I never took her that seriously. I'm ashamed to admit, but it's true, because what does she knows, Yeah. But she knows so much better than anyone else. She literally lived through that. They had to escape. They looted their house. They burned down the synagogue. She told me, I came back to my house. There was not even a chair, not a carpet, nothing. They took everything away. And like a year or two later, she found herself in Israel because there was nothing there anymore. And that's a society that is from the second that has been there for over 2,000 years or something in Aleppo. It's crazy. And so going back to that previous question I asked you, do you think, I'm struggling with this question, do you think that Israel saw the October 7th as an existential threat on the country? But if you judge from the response, do you think it
is?
But do you think Israel's response was adequate in terms of they saw it as an existential threat?
You mean, is the response adequate right now?
The response on October 7th, on October 8th, and today.
I think the vast majority of Israelis viscerally understand that it's an existential threat. A lot of people try now to kind of downplay it. Oh, it was never going to be an existential threat. Oh, we remember that moment. There's a moment suddenly when there's a tear in time, when there's a tear in reality. There was a sense that we were going to be slaughtered from every direction, inside, outside. Because at the end of the day, let's talk about what it means to be an existential threat. The Jews have one reality, which is the one reality they can never escape from, which is they're small people. Because of the way we developed, we're a tribe, a joinable tribe, but we're not an expanding, it's not like Christianity or Islam. We're always going to be small. And the big moment for me, in really understanding that, when I visited Villa Wannsee. Villa Wannsee is the gorgeous villa on the outskirts of Berlin, next to a peaceful lake, where the final solution was discussed and essentially finalized. And I found that even though I visited Auschwitz later, visiting Villa Wannsee was much more shocking to me and harrowing than visiting Auschwitz. Because Villa Wannsee is so beautiful and peaceful, and the lake is lovely. And to imagine that people gathered, educated people, gathered there around a table and thought through the final solution. Now, why could they imagine a final solution to the Jewish question, which is what it was called? There's a chart that you can purchase there, which basically has the Nazis listing the number of Jews in every territory that they occupied and every territory that they still plan to occupy. So they list the number of Jews in Britain or in Ireland. And it says, okay, so many Jews in Poland, so many Jews in Belarus. It goes, and then there's a line, the way you do summation, and underneath it says 11 million. So they looked at the total number of Jews across the lands that they occupied or were planning to occupy, and they thought to themselves, 11 million, that's doable. Like, we can imagine with our technology, with our industry, a final solution to the Jewish question. In the same way, there is no understanding the conflict without understanding that the Jews are a puny minority in an overwhelming Arab and Islamic Middle East, which again is one of the other major reasons why they never see a reason to compromise with the Jews. Why should they compromise with a tiny minority? So we are surrounded by ideologies, countries, people, still largely very hostile to our very existence as an equal sovereign people. And this means that they can imagine our annihilation as something very practical. When I would visit various European capitals, meet with government officials who are funding UNRWA, and I would tell them, that the Arabs are very serious about the idea of return, and again, that it's not an innocent idea. And they would tell me, no, that's not serious. They know that they're not returning. They understand that Israel's here to stay. And I'm like, look, if anyone is irrational in this conflict, it's not them. They're looking at 7 million Jews struggling to survive amidst 500 million Arabs, nearly 2 billion Muslims, again, still largely hostile to the existence of a Jewish state. And they not irrationally conclude that this experiment in Zionist, Jewish self-determination is not going to last long. So this is why Sinwar can imagine himself the new Salah ad-Din, the one who is on the verge of bringing the annihilation of the Jewish state. So yes, it's very, very much existential. And anyone who's trying to downplay it, to claim that it's not true, is literally not opening a map.
And is it correct to qualify this war as a war against Hamas as opposed to a war against the Palestinians? We didn't have a war against the SS.
Yeah.
Right? We had a war against the Germans. the Germans. That's how people talked at the time.
So what's important to be clear here is that, of course, that the war was against Germany or against Japan. But once they were defeated and surrendered, and there was an occupation that denazified and racial imperialized them, then there was a Germany and there was a Japan. A lot of people immediately say, oh, if you're saying that Hamas actually represents the Palestinians very well and represents their deepest ethos and vision, you're calling to kill them all. And I'm like, where did you learn logic in school? No, it's to say that this is a war against a people who right now have an extreme annihilationist ideology, but that the future, peace, the end of the war, lies in their changing that ideology. And that is something that needs to be placed as the goal of the war. The goal of the war should not be killing 30,000 Hamas operatives. That is, at the end of the day, a worthless goal. Because as long as the Palestinian ideology remains no Jewish state from the river to the sea, it will always breed a new Hamas. So this is the moment to say the ideology has to go, not the people. The ideology has to go. Once that ideology goes, then just like Japan and Germany became pillars of world peace, then yes, we can have peace, but we cannot have peace as long as the very definition of what it means to be a Palestinian is first and foremost no Jewish state.
So if I, try and move forward with that logic when we compare it to Germany and Japan at the time, which I think it's the logical comparison, we all know how that ended to the Germans and to the Japanese. It ended in 2 atom bombs dropping on, Japan, and I believe 8 million Germans. A lot of them were dead. A lot of them were civilians. And this is not really, from my perspective, how Israel has approached this. Not that I'm advocating for dropping an atom bomb on Gaza, and that's why I asked you before if you think that Israel sees it as an existential threat. Because if you do, then, at least in my book, when I read history, you just go full force ahead. And, how do you break this cycle, this ideology? Can it, like, we did it in the past, like not we, but it has been done in the past. In Germany, the Germans were on their knees. That's what happened after World War II. And the Americans, the Allies, were generous enough to say, hey, we're not going to do what the Soviets are doing. We're going to give you everything you need. And we're going to give you a lot of money to establish yourself. But before they did that, they completely destroyed them, like completely. Are we doing... Is it the Israeli approach as well? Is it fair to say that? Because again, there's a lot of Israeli officials, including Netanyahu, they insist on saying this is a war against Hamas, and they say it publicly. And I see it, again, we talked about it before, as a sign of kind of weakness. I'm sorry to say. I don't criticize them. It's not my place. But I'm saying it is not, because, okay, yes, Hamas, sure. But again, we have the West Bank here, and they don't differ that much at all. So
I do criticize Israel for that. I think we've been very muddled in our approach. I think from the first day, by the way, the reason that I started delving deeper into Japan, I'm sure you know, in Israel, we don't think much about Japan in World War II because of the Nazis, because of the Holocaust. We are only on Europe. So a friend of mine, within days of October 7th, he wrote to me, he said, look at the Potsdam Declaration. And the Potsdam Declaration is what the Allies are saying to the Japanese as the conditions of surrender. And I began to write sense that this is what I wanted Israel to do. I think we still need to do, and we've been very muddled. The brilliance of what the Allies did is that in the depth of the war, they already envisioned a peaceful, disarmed Japan that is democratic, and that positive vision was the condition of surrender. So what the Allies did, they basically said, Japan, you either become this or total and utter destruction. That's the word. And I think what Israel did is, and we should know the destruction that Israel was wreaking in Gaza is proportionately not far from that of Japan and Germany, if you look at per capita or proportionally. I think where we were completely delinquent is not linking it completely with the vision and an ultimatum for what Palestinian society can be. So I think from the first day, we should have said clearly, Palestinians all over, release the hostages, disarm, hand over the perpetrators of the massacre to justice, and publicly forgo from the river to the sea as your ideology. Because that's the ideology that brought us here. So that has to go. It's not enough for you to disarm. It's not enough for Hamas to be handed over. It's not even enough to release the hostages. The ideology has to go for us to move forward. And I think this should have been said every morning. And just to say, this could end tomorrow. Those are the 4 conditions. Release the hostages, disarm, hand over the perpetrators, forgo from the river to the sea. Until then, utter and complete destruction. I think where we were delinquent is in really making it clear that we are operating in order to have a different vision. And by the way, I think we should also be clear that once Palestinian society is transformed, we are very much eager to live in peace next to it. I will add, absolutely, a Palestinian state living side by side, but a Palestinian state that wants to live next to the Jewish state rather than serve as a platform for its destruction. So this is the place where I think we've been muddled. I think we've been muddled in a variety of ways. We are still being muddled. And I think it's a major problem for the way that we're conducting this operation, the way we're presenting our case to the world, and within Israel as well.
Yeah. And the talk in Israel, and I remember it also as a soldier, was, what would the world say? It's a massive. I don't think a lot of people understand it. I've never heard any other citizen of any other country think about it. What if we do this? What would the world say? In Israel, it's so profound. And are we blowing it out of proportion? Like the response of the world to our conduct? Like, I think, I read your interview in Ma'ariv. I thought it was great. And we talked about it a little bit before, and you said, and it's a paraphrasing. You said maybe Israeli police shouldn't be that efficient in stopping the demonstrations in Kerem Shalom to let the humanitarian aid convoys going into Gaza. Or you said also maybe the union workers in Ashdod, in Amal Ashdod, the port, should not just deal the merchandise that comes to aid Gaza. And, I have to say, I haven't heard anyone saying that before, and I thought it was great. And why is it that we have this innate fear from the international response to any action that we do? And are we, again, blowing it out of proportion?
So I do think there's something about being a small minority that continues deep in our psyche, that so much of our fate was decided by others, that I think even as a sovereign people, we still have that. And also my experience has been that nothing ever gets said about Israel that has not been first said by Israelis. Yeah. So we often export our disagreements, conversations, and kind of loop the world into it and then kind of import it back to say, see, that's what they're saying, but we're the ones that said it to them. So there's also a big part of that. But yes, I think we have been subjected, and as a result, subjecting ourselves to standards that no one in the world has ever been. I mean, you call it humanitarian aid. I call it supplying the enemy in a time of war. I insist on that phrasing.
I agree with you.
We conveniently allow the world to ignore that Gaza has a border with Egypt. We don't hold Egypt accountable for anything, even though it has a large share in what's happening here. I think on the first day, I wrote it to a few people, but, it sounded a bit crazy. But I thought, okay, we should just sit on the border with trucks waiting on the border, not supply electricity, not supply water. Again, there's a border with Egypt. It's not on us. And to say a very simple thing, nothing goes in until the hostages come out. I think it's a completely legitimate message. The fact that we have normalized that, Hamas went into people's homes, kidnapped them from their beds, entire families, from babies to elders, and now Israel has to negotiate their release. Look how quickly we've fallen into sure, Israel's negotiating, Israel's not giving enough, Israel should give more. In what world is that a basis for negotiation? I mean, in another world that obviously doesn't exist, the president of the Secretary General of the United Nations and the head of the International Red Cross would have gone on October 8th to the Rafah crossing, the border with Egypt, and said, Israel owes you nothing. Israel doesn't need to negotiate the release of hostages because you have zero right to get them. And you shouldn't receive anything. The fact that Israel is pressured to supplying its enemy in a time of war, thereby extending the war, extending the suffering all around. We pay for it in the lives of our best people. Whoever had to fight a war under those conditions? And, again, we talk about the deep recesses of the Western psyche. I sometimes, I talk about it with a friend of mine that there's something deep there that cannot abide by Jews winning, and even something in the Jewish psyche feels uncomfortable with Jews winning. So we give in rather than standing up and saying, no army has ever had to fight this way, and we're being very reasonable. Nothing goes in until the hostages come out. Anything more reasonable than that?
I'm fully in agreement with you on that. What do you think would be the response to that action? What do you think the United States would do?
Of course there would be pressure and a crying out, but that was what there was. But again, I think this is the moment to stand firm and to say, look, this will actually make the war shorter.
Right.
This will end it quicker. What in what we're saying is unreasonable. This is also the reason that when President Biden, and you talked about the Israelis echoing that, when President Biden came to Israel in the first few days, and you talked about existential, we felt that we were going to be slaughtered from every direction, north, south, east, inside. And we were so thankful for him saying, don't. But then as he left, he said, and Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians. Yeah. And I remember listening to that and thinking, oh, we're going to pay for that, and we're going to pay dearly. And I think this was the moment for, hopefully a more credible Israeli leader to stand up and to say to the American president, we appreciate what you're doing so much, but it's time that we acknowledge the truth. Hamas represents the Palestinians. It has carried out their deepest desire. And we are fighting a total ideology of annihilationism rather than 30,000 trained murderers. So that's how we need to operate. And I think that was the moment to just keep saying that again and again and again. and to say this is the moment where we need to change history, where we can't let another century of an annihilationist ideology to continue. This is precisely the moment when this ideology is laid bare, when people can see where that ideology leads, to say this ideology has to end everywhere, in Gaza, in the West Bank, everywhere. This is not an ideology that could be allowed to stand.
Yeah. Let's try and end on a more positive note.
Sure.
Because this was for the record, I'm fully in agreement with you. And the reason I asked the previous question was because I was very surprised. And my brother lives in the Gaza envelope. Luckily, the kibbutz where he lives was not impacted directly from the terrorists. But still, it was a terrifying moment for everyone. And I remember talking to friends and everything at the time, and a bit surprised by the response. A bit surprised, because I saw that as, again, like a historical moment where you need to have complete and utter victory. And I know we're gonna, Israel's gonna get it. It's gonna have the victory at the end of the day. But there's something about the immediate days after of the massacre that shook me profoundly, and pretty much everyone as well. So that's why I wanted to kind of hear your opinions on that. Okay, so again, what are you hopeful for? And maybe we can talk about the rapprochement between Israel and the Arab world, and some of the, let's take it full circle back. What we said before, any failing society is starting to cast blame on a specific group, mostly the Jews. And every prosperous society, this is a society where Jews prosper. And the perfect example, as we said before, is the Arab world and the UAE and Bahrain and maybe Saudi Arabia now. So what are your thoughts on that and the future of Israel here in this region?
So I find my hope now in several directions. One is indeed the beginning of some transformations in the Arab world. The way that I taught the course on Zionism and anti-Zionism is I showed that every kind of ideological structure could always support both Zionism and anti-Zionism. So Jewish civilization can support Zionism and anti-Zionism. Christianity can support Zionism and anti-Zionism. Socialism can support Zionism. So I show that. So towards the end, I make the same argument that Arabism and Islam have supported anti-Zionism, but they could also support Zionism, because those are all systems of interpretation at the end of the day. So there's nothing to prevent the reinterpretation of an Arab identity and Islam as actually Abrahamic, as supporting not only just the Jewish right to self-determination, but that is recognizing Israel as the legitimate continuation of the ancient historical connection of the people of Israel to the land of Israel. And that is equally Muslim to the Islam that says that there cannot be a Jewish state. They are equally valid interpretations of that system of thought. And again, it's not a coincidence that countries that seek to be more modern, future-looking, embrace modernity, are also the ones that are letting go of anti-Zionism, the ones that are seeking to talk about Arab success rather than this discussion for the last century in the Arab world of Arab failure. So certainly that's where I see hope, because as long as we care about the land of Canaan, and as I said, the 7th century conquests were hugely successful, we are stuck, shall we say. We are damned or destined, choose your word, to remain a minority in an Arab and Muslim region. So our only way to ever have peace is for the Arab and Muslim world, the overwhelming dominant force here, to look at the Jewish people, and rather than say crusader, foreign, colonialist, to say Abraham, to say, we recognize you and you belong here. The other source of hope, of course, is Israeli society. I underestimated my people once, and I'm determined not to do it again. After the failure of the Camp David negotiations in 2000, the brutality and massacre of the Second Intifada, I thought no one will stay in Israel. I thought if we cannot believe in the immediate possibility of peace, what will hold us here through the massacres and the violence and the wars and the brutality? And I saw my people move on.
All right.
So I know that Israeli society is resilient. We have certainly seen since October 7th, Israeli society rise to the moment. The Israeli reservists rise to the moment, the military. Our government sink to the moment. A complete wasteland of mediocrity, and I'm being generous. Yeah. But I know that we will close the gap because Israel doesn't have any space to maneuver, right? Other countries can descend slowly into third world mediocrity and they'll still be fine. We, as soon as we begin our descent, we're slaughtered, right? Because those around us are just waiting for a moment of weakness, a crack. So for good or for bad, we have no choice. We have no room for maneuver, which means that this mediocrity that was allowed to reign for quite some time now, this government that thought that you can nominate corrupt mediocrities, that you can gut the politics, that you can gut our civil service, and Israel will be okay. No, it actually doesn't work for the Jewish state. And just like that meme that, hard times create strong leaders create good times, that. So we had strong leaders that created good times that created really bad and appeasement basis soft leaders. And now they created hard times. And those hard times, I have no doubt, will forge strong leaders.
Yeah. Shout out to one of my former military buddies, Matan Katzman, who just became the mayor of Even Yehuda. So it's a big deal. He's a great guy. He's also like lieutenant colonel in the IDF, was a reservist and everything. So this is, again, it's a good step in the right direction. I hope that many people like him would also, go to politics and make the change. But I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure talking to you in person. And I feel much more educated now on this issue. It's great. And anything else you want to say?
No, just to say thank you.